Yeah, so welcome at the beginning of COFESTIVAL. Now we will hear a lecture of Andros Zins-Browne on immaterial bodies, basically the possibility of virtual body. I said that I will say a few words at the beginning. I met Andros in October 2004 at the Discourse Festival in Gießen, Germany, and somehow we stayed in contact for the last 10 years. I saw his first piece, and I didn't basically manage to see his next pieces. He's coming from New York, working in Brussels. He's based in Brussels, and he's for the first time in Ljubljana. And I'm very glad that we managed to organize this. He's going to stay in Ljubljana for a very short time, and I hope that the next time we will see one of your performances. So I would like to welcome you, and let's begin.
Thanks. Okay. English is okay for everyone?
Yes.
Otherwise I can switch to Slovenian. So yeah, this is going to be a kind of mixture of paper that I gave in the Young Bank Academy about 2 years ago in Maastricht, and a lecture performance that I was invited to give at the HAU in Berlin about a year ago. Rock and I talked about whether we should have an after talk or not, and of course we can, but also we can have an in-between talk, so if you want to interrupt with anything or ask questions or whatever, just go ahead. And definitely if I've been talking about myself for too long, just stop me and let me know. Most of my work has been about trying to get away from this idea of any kind of personal history or essence or any sense of myself. So I'm very happy to be able to be here and get to talk for half an hour only about myself. It's a nice, rare opportunity. I'm going to start with crisis number 1. About 11 years ago, when I was at Brown University in Rhode Island, I trained as a ballet dancer since about the age of 7. And I'd made a few of my own pieces in high school. And I guess by the time I went to university, I was about 17, and I really kind of had my career path set out for me. I was very sure I was going to be a dance choreographer. And so I went to Brown and started to pursue that. And pretty quickly, within 3 months or so, I found that the dance classes I was doing not only didn't quite stimulate me, but actually really depressed me. Enough that after a couple of months, I was ready to completely quit dance altogether. So there was this period of, from like age 7 to age 17, this like very nice linear path from ballet to being a choreographer, which just kind of all fell apart in the process of about 3 months. So this paper kind of gave me the opportunity to look back at that time and think about what that meant for me. I started at that point, once I stopped doing dance, to take classes in whatever I could find, and somehow I ended up in literature, and from literature to literary theory to cultural theory to art theory to art, and that was the context which I first encountered performance art in. And that was very interesting for me, because after this 10-year period of doing dance, I was discovering really this new form of performance that I'd never encountered before. And I'm talking here about artists like Carolee Schneemann, Vito Conchi, Chris Burden, Marina Abramovich, Dan Graham, etc. I think I hadn't really done the diligence of analyzing why it was that I was so depressed with the dance I was doing, and consequently why I was so struck by the work of these artists. But there was something for me looking back on it now which had to do with the fact that these weren't about the forms that the body could produce or the structures within which bodies could produce forms, but about the meaning of the body itself. So I was 18 at the time, but there was something undeniable, the fact that there was something so real about what these bodies were doing, and I want to come back to this idea of this real body again and again. These artists invoked the notion that the body was real, that it was corporeal, hairy, bloody, sexed, gendered, raced, that it was mutable, finite. And this realness was something which for them they needed the public to confront, and which they needed to confront themselves. And there was this particular fold I found between the need for these artists some 30 years before to produce these works, and for me to encounter them 30 years later. My question is, why was it that there was this radical necessity for these artists to represent the body as real in this period? And why was there that I would say not so radical necessity for me to encounter them and the idea of the body as real 30 years later? So to answer the first question, I have to kind of generalize a bit in order to avoid this being a performance art history talk or to get too much into this philosophical notion of the real. But I think that what these artists were putting forward was that the body was in relationship to a particular historical environment where the beginnings of what I would call a derealization of the body was taking place. Not really for the first time, but on a massive scale for the first time. This is a period where unreal bodies, mediated bodies especially, but other kinds of unreal bodies were taking over. This was Night of the Living Dead. And the movement that these bodies were performing were, for me, first and foremost, a resistance movement. I literally haven't done that piece in about 13 years. So it was necessary to insist then that, no, the body is real. Its physical, corporeal, and scatological definitions, capabilities, and limits need to be staged because they cannot or should not merely be erased by culture. So fiction being one of the most powerful ways by which culture not only produces, but can also erase the body, became something which had to be rejected. If we go to the No Manifesto of Yvonne Rainer from 1965, she says, "No to spectacle, no to virtuosity, no to transformations and magic and make-believe, no to the glamour and transcendency of the star image, no to the heroic, no to the anti-heroic, no to trash imagery, no to involvement of performer or spectator, no to style, no to camp, no to seduction of spectator by the wiles of the performer, no to eccentricity, no to moving or being moved." On the other side of this fold, why was it at this particular moment that I found this already kind of dated work to be so fresh and new for me? Here I think in retrospect I was looking for a way of working with the body where the body could be more than an articulation of aesthetic ideas. And it was also this period where I was in kind of university cultural studies and learning that the body and everything around us was no longer real, that we had entered into this simulacral, artificial era. And somehow I guess I felt like I wanted to resist these ideas, and I could lean on the work of those performance artists to do so. So at that point I started making some of my own performance art pieces, and I made quite a few, part of which you saw there. Some were terrible and some were not so bad. But pretty soon I found that I hit a limit. Something had happened to the reality of the body, or at least to the poetic of the real body. It just dropped out. It emptied itself out. And partly I guess that had to do with the exact same theories which I wanted to resist. Of reality as a construct, of society entering a simulacral order, etc. Of these being pretty more or less good and true arguments at the time. But partly to do with the fact that the expression of the body's limits, in the end, had limits of its own. So using the body itself as the site and the material of the performance can maybe only have so many applications. And I think this was illustrated the best by Steve-O. I don't know if you know him, but he was the star of an MTV show called Jackass. So if you haven't seen the show, it basically involved this young guy sticking all kinds of things, whatever he could find, into whatever holes of his body he could, and then either lighting them on fire or submitting them to electrical shock, putting himself in extreme conditions of velocity or propulsion. And if it wasn't dead already, I would say that performance art of any specifically body kind was essentially killed right there by Steve-O. And I think he had a very clear point, even if it wasn't an intentional one. What he was saying was, the body is indeed real. It's real, and also, who gives a shit? The real little bodies. Okay. So in other words, I think what he was doing, what it came down to was, who really gives a shit about the real? And I'd say he had a point which somehow, at least for me, at that time spoke much louder and clearer than Jean Baudrillard had. And inherently what I think he meant was that the body as the primary site of performance was just dead. I mean, that if we think of the evolution from Chris Burden getting shot in the arm in the F-Space Gallery in 1971 in Berkeley, to Steve-O getting electrically shocked on his balls on MTV in 2001, I think we can see a kind of clear evolution of this idea. Figuratively and literally, there was no more body left to transgress. Okay, so let's put a place mark here and say that the real body is dead from this point on. So throwing myself to the ground over and over again and putting my body in harm's way for the sake of art is now banal and obsolete. And here we come to crisis moment number 2. Wondering where the body can go from here. If it can't go back to fairy tales, but it can't either shock its own balls and hope for some kind of sublime impact of the real to occur. The real is something which at this point more or less is meaningless, or even worse, meaningful, but just not that interesting anymore. So now it's like 2002, when I moved to Brussels to study dance at the School of Anne-Therese de Keersmacher parts. And this is for me some sort of like avoiding the economic crisis by going to live in the bank. I mean, I had no idea whatsoever what it was I was doing or what I wanted to do. And in this kind of typical response to a crisis moment, I convinced myself that I had to go back to the past and just do it better. This meant really going back to movement, and trying to do movement better. The language of performance art, body art, etc. was over for me, and it was in abstract dance that I could see again the most possibilities. So I had this desire to do 5, 6, 7, 8 again. And to come home sore and sweaty. And to wake up with knots and bruises. And it was clear that parts was definitely the place to do that in. The irony was that, again, after a couple of months at parts, I started to get very depressed with what it was I was doing. So this is where crisis moment number 2 kind of quickly leads to crisis moment number 3. I've moved all the way to Europe from New York to discover my own movement, language, and style, and I realized that I'm not only not interested in my own movement and language and style, but in movement, language, and style at all. And I remember feeling the first few days at parts, seeing everyone bouncing off the walls of the studio, trying to somehow show their own individuality, and feeling like I just wanted to move back home. And it was in that context of dance malaise that I saw the first few performances of conceptual dance. The body seems to have a cultural survival instinct as much as it has a biological one. And if culturally the body had to survive being killed by Steve-O, it had to mutate. With conceptual dance it did. It cloned and copied and multiplied itself. It escaped being killed by the meaninglessness of the real by slipping into simulation. And the idea of a body who was no longer real and singular, but multiple, and meaning whatever the artist wanted it to mean, seemed like it could last forever. So conceptual dance kind of reconfirmed for me the feeling that I was having in my stomach in a way that conceptual art and the visual arts never had. And that was in terms of presence, authorship, and originality, identity, and singularity, resisting all these things. And these artists, I'm talking about Jerome Bell, the earlier works of Kino Šiška, Xavier Leroy. These artists weren't doing originality at all. They were doing mimicry, imitation, and it was much more about which sources they chose to imitate and why. These weren't necessarily new ideas as much as they were really new ways of embodying already existing ideas. To see something being called dance, which at that time, at the same time, had no essence, no limit between dancing and not dancing, doing and not doing, creating and imitating, just this endless play of signification and everything that a body could do as a blank slate was exciting for me. just started smoking again, sorry. So I think it also produced a problem for me at the same time. The problem was essentially what to do with my desire to work with the body and to work with dance and movement when everything about abstract languages, from its claim to authenticity and originality and its relevance, or its irrelevance, to contemporary culture, was somewhat obsolete. At the same time, I wanted to continue to work with physicalities beyond illustrating ideas. I liked the idea that doing could change thinking, and thinking could change doing, and that intense physical investment could change what one could think about something as they could think about it otherwise. So this led me to try to overcome a fault line I saw between so-called conceptual and so-called movement-based choreography. I didn't want, at that point, to invent bodies. I wanted rather to adopt bodies, to borrow and steal bodies, to lend my body to other bodies. Appropriation might be a too reductive term, but I wanted to become other bodies, to see their potentials, rather than to realize the potentials of my own. Then, if my body was as good as any other body, why this or that body? Why not this and that body? And if this and that body, what did the possibility of this and that body mean within a single body? I remember when I heard my first mashup. It was around 2004, and it was the Black Eyed Peas' Shut Up and Kylie Minogue's Can't Get You Out of My Head, and it was really good. And a ton of these mashups followed, and I even made a few to play at parties. And as the software advanced, it became easier and easier to make them. And soon after that, I couldn't stand to hear one more fucking mashup again. I think I've lost count, but we're somewhere at crisis number 4. Yeah. Mashup, yeah. A mashup is when you have 2 different songs and you put them together to make one song. So this was like Black Eyed Peas, shut up, just shut up, shut up, shut 'em up, just shut up, you know that song? And Kylie Minogue, can't get you out of my head, boy, yeah. Put together in one amazing All the excitement I had with conceptual dance, using recognizable rather than abstract bodies, mixing and matching their signs and meanings, went somehow in the same way. At a certain point, the language of representation, I mean that of known, recognizable bodies and representational movements, had pretty much run out for me. In a similar way, I guess, as the status of the real body had some 8 years earlier. Signs and signification have become too easily relocatable and movable, or at least relocating and moving them on stage no longer seem to have anything existentially at stake for itself, not as it once did. I'd like to propose the idea that we no longer have bodies, but we aren't bodiless yet. The biggest problem of all is that we still have bodies. If we didn't have bodies anymore, things would be pretty smooth. If we were completely immersed in a non-corporeal reality, we would either have the possibility to deal with the body purely on the level of experience without the necessity to have this physical interface, or to invent wholly other concepts of what a body could be. The performance artist Delarc grew a real human ear on his arm, but he knew before he did that what the ear would look like, and that it would respect the boundaries of his arm. This isn't what I'm interested in. Nothing deserves to remain perceivable as wholesale anymore. And ideally, the original sources should become unclear or irrelevant. If bodies, things, and places are becoming more and more quasi, I think we should look for bodies which are neither nor bodies, which are bodies that could be but aren't bodies, bodies who are also and bodies. Not as a matter of collage, because this is no longer the digital order of the Photoshop or mashup body, but about a body who from many sources becomes an integrated whole. Not this or that whole, nor this and that whole, not where the wholes respect each other's autonomous spaces, an ear that respects the boundaries of an arm, but neither appropriation, not a body or a dancer who moves like a monkey or an athlete or a rock and roller or an avatar. On the other hand, I want to be aware of the retreat, of force, of clarity, of statement. Something quasi shouldn't become something less clear, less potent, less articulate than. It should rather accumulate more depth and dimension via the strange logic of embodiment. So the body isn't real, nor is the body artificial, but it's really a site where the real and the artificial pass through, become embodied, and come out twisted on the other end. How to make these translations. How to make translations which elude representation, imitation, citation, and still have a meaning which deals with physicality and a reality of experience. For the past several years, I've been more interested in finding physicalities that are relevant, but which at the same time can't fit into the bodies I work with. Contemporary dancers are basically too good. They absorb everything quickly, and they make it fit almost immediately. From this idea, I made two pieces on the idea of a utopian body. One was with elderly people over the age of 70, and the other was with a professional Michael Jackson impersonator. For me, these two projects were a lot about trying to get at a virtual body, an is but isn't body, a body whose representation was in the fact of its real physical abilities and limitations rather than a blank slate who was able to absorb or become anything. I wanted to translate into a body physicalities that will necessarily be mistranslated. So we no longer have bodies. We don't yet not have bodies. I wanted to work towards the idea of an immaterial body. Not identity bodies, not signed bodies, but unbodied bodies. How can something be really a body but not actually a body, a presence, a movement? What started in the idea of making a hologram video of a Michael Jackson impersonator, which was neither a body nor just an image, appearing and disappearing in the middle of the room, and a piece of elderly people in a kind of virtual reality old age home, led me to think that this quasi-body also had to be a two-way street. If it led me to try to dematerialize the body, it should also lead me to try to embody materials. What does it mean to think light, sound, or objects in terms of movement and choreography? And how can movement itself be perceived as a medium, regardless of its material, body, or otherwise? How can we think of literally everything as potentially being a body, whose movement can be organized in time and space? A floor or a wall is really a body, but not actually a body. And these are the kind of bodies I'd like to continue to work with. I'll leave it there, open for questions or comments. Thank you.
As well. This, I was thinking of one anecdote of which Simona tells. Sometimes she's epileptic. I think that almost everybody, at least some of you, Simona Semenic did this performance, Me Victim, in which she talks about her different, let's say, diseases, let's say, and motherhood as well at the end, which is kind of ironic as switch. And she, for example, she told me she was operated in Grenoble, and try to locate the center of which generates these epileptic seizures and everything. So basically they did quite a few experiments with her. I mean, they tried to, it was a kind of a methodological medical procedure to find the center. And she said that, for example, that they would somehow stimulate these different centers around this center which generates epileptic seizures. And she said that she, for example, had an experience without some basically effects of physical actions without really doing them. I mean, this is quite an I think this is quite interesting kind of example, because, for example, when you are, when you are developing this idea of getting to this no body or embodied body, it's for me somehow the question for me occurred basically what's happening with the perception of this kind of construct. And this also I think it might be connected somehow to this notion of kind of kinesthetics, or something that would basically affect the spectator, let's say, without an object being present or something. I'm trying to imagine this kind of drastic kind of example. And the other, let's say, another layer of it would be then how these effects would produce a certain kind of meaning. But I think basically everybody that you're talking is connected, I guess, with quite sophisticated technology that would, or not.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, to give you an example, like I would say, like I was talking about these artists like Sabelouage or Bell, this period, I would say that period of dance kind of demonstrated this supreme control. Like really this idea of what I think and how I think can literally be produced. So it's not this kind of abstract mystery, next to it or something like this. It's in complete control, and I would say that indeed that's something which I'm not necessarily interested in, and what you're talking about reminds me of something I am interested in, which has to do more with I have this intention, but what I filter it through will necessarily mistranslate it. And to give an example, I guess that this was something when I worked with the elderly people, I spoke kind of briefly about this idea of perception. For instance, with them we had these iPods where they were being given these kind of new age guru workshops, kind of mind-body centering workshops. And let's say the intentions of the instructions they were receiving were quite clear, like not necessarily what it is that they should be doing, but what they should be experiencing or trying to investigate. But what this actually produced in terms of movement was something completely haywire. So, and I quite liked that. At the same time, it meant that the instructions had to be very clear and at the same time open. If they got confused, you didn't get a mistranslation. You got them being lost. And if they were too clear in the sense of raise your right hand or take a deep breath or whatever, we lost the possibility for this kind of strange interpretation. As for the whole thing about technology, I mean, I don't know, but I guess one has to make the distinction between virtuality and virtual reality. And I would say I'm not so interested in virtual reality as I am in virtuality. Virtual reality has more to do with the technological aspect for me. And I try to think much more, like I was talking about during the talk, about something, how to make something which is but is not, and this is for me really trying to. One of the things I really try to work with now is the idea of thinking of things as bodies. I really try to take that idea literally, which might sound like magic show, but it's kind of not, and it's not so super technological. There are no sensors or lasers or.
Sorry, just asking, you work with this practically? Like if you say I try to think of objects as bodies, for example, you have these two speakers, so you work with it practically, or it's a concept that you're developing without really like how do you approach it?
Yeah, this is the point where whenever I say that, people are like, okay. What do you really mean? Yeah, I mean, well, I can give you concrete examples. The last piece I made worked with inflatables. So we had a floor, like it would be this floor. I mean, it's quite flat. You see some ripples in it. But underneath are all these inflatables, which are on different channels. A little bit technological, but not so hyper-technological. The channels are on light dimmers, so like you would dim or raise the light, you're changing the electrical flow into the blowers, which meant that the floor was moving in different parts at different times, at different speeds, different heights, etc. And so for me, this was really the first 10 minutes of the piece is only this, and I really tried to treat it like a choreography. The next piece, I mean, there were also performers, cowboys, long story, I won't go into it yet, but the next piece that I work on also has to do with a sense of movement of things. In this case, it's a kind of mirror hall, but in like a house of mirrors, but in a rather dark space. So these mirrors are moving, and we're trying to work out a way that we can get a kind of sense, a perception of space. It sounds a little bit, but of space moving. So I mean, of course, it does matter which materials you choose, you know. It's like, which dancers would you choose if you're going to make a dance piece? And of course, you want to work with materials which somehow are, flexible dancers. But I think it's a concept I try to practically realize.
I would like to ask you, when you started briefly your path, like you were dancer and choreographer, and my interest is how you mentioned quite some studies, cultural studies and so on, and theories. Is how come that into you when you were a dancer or choreographer? Did you find that, or you are finding it now quite important? Is it some idea which is more echoing into your last body, or maybe into your point of crisis? Do you find it, some of them really, connection maybe is not the right word, but how is that with your first being dancer, choreographer, and then into these different studies?
I don't know, I think I have like a pretty, I'd say back and forth relationship with theory, in the sense, it was in a weird way what brought me back to dance, which might seem strange, but when I said briefly that I'd kind of gone into literature, there was a point where a lot of the literary theory I was reading made me really kind of turn away from thinking of literature and authorship, and think much more visually about complicating this idea of authorship. So it was this weird thing where it led me back into dance, but then once I got back into dance, I would say it was pretty lonely to try to integrate this with theory. And for sure, by the time I went into when I first got to parts, and it was very much focused on the body and physical practice, this theoretical component kind of disappeared. And I guess since then, I would say I have a love-hate relationship. It's going back and forth for me entirely. I do think that what's been really important for me is to really try to keep a physical practice. And even if I don't sort of know exactly how, theoretical study is influencing what I'm doing physically, that I found I need that physical practice in order for the theory to actually have an effect or make changes in the way that I think and do things. So periods, for instance, I had like a 2-year residency in Maastricht, so I was pretty much reading and thinking and writing, and I would say it was like one of the least productive periods in my work. So I found like it's really necessary to keep these tracks simultaneously. Does that somehow answer your question?
I would like to ask you, because you mentioned that this time when you kind of went away from dance and you came in contact with these performance artists, you mentioned that for you they embodied a kind of resistance. And I'm interested in the interest that you have now, like to work with bodies that are at the same time non-bodies and so on. If you also have the feeling that in there is a potential of resistance, or if there is, if this is still something that is triggering for you, and what could that be?
I think that's a super interesting question. I don't know if I've ever analyzed or articulated it in that kind of way, but I would say your question makes me think about the way that we're used to interacting with materials, which I'd say is, rather consumerist form of reaction, of interaction. One of the things that I felt I really wanted to work on, a piece I'm working on right now, it's how to put audience in a place where they really feel unsure about their space, about the objects around them, to a degree which is somehow threatening, like really unsure about how things will react, and which is erratic. And I guess one of the things that I don't like in a lot of experiments that I've seen, or performances that I've seen that use objects, is that the form of relation is very consumerist, in the sense of like, we get pleasure out of our interaction with this thing, or these bodies around us are there for us, and for our pleasure. And so for me, this kind of reestablishes a hierarchy between people and things, which is anyway, everywhere in our culture. And I guess I do have some intention to try to destabilize that. I mean, if you think about the notion of the theater space has this idea that it should be black, neutral, that it should disappear. And it's kind of romantic notion, I think, that we have from nature. Nature is there, it's a background, right, so that humans can project their subjectivity and individual will. And I think politically here there's something very problematic, which I'm interested in addressing. As for whether the things themselves, and I don't know if that's where your question kind of goes into an area that I'm like, and I have to think about some more, whether the things themselves are somehow able to engage in this resistance as actors. I don't know if that was the area of your question, but that's quite interesting. And I don't know.
bodies of 70 years old, real or unreal, with this kind of...
Did I find them real or unreal?
Yeah.
Oh, they were very real.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was the interest, really, in working with them. I think was you can't kind of deny their analog. You know, they have limitations. They're very, very clear limitations. So I was interested in kind of taking these very analog bodies and putting them into this very, say, digital situation, which was, this kind of like virtual reality world. They didn't interact with each other. If they did, they were side by side, kind of looking out, following things together, but there was no real interaction between them. Any other questions or comments?
In fact, I have another question. This, when you speak about, because I was also away for some time, so maybe you explain this a bit. When you speak about this, because I imagine it as a kind of space between it is and it isn't. So it's a kind of field of potentialities, or somehow some kind of becoming that is this space. Or how, can you tell me something more about this space between it is and it isn't?
I mean, it is and it isn't for me to say, well, it can mean many things, obviously, but for me, the way I've kind of related to it was really trying to put things together which resisted each other, which wouldn't integrate easily. And that's what I was talking about. But I found after a while, being a dancer myself and working with dancers, that it was only a matter of rehearsal or practice before things became sort of smoothly integrated. And there's this kind of smoothness. For instance, when I was working with this Michael Jackson impersonator, and he's like touring the world doing shows as Michael Jackson, but to get him to try to be in a pose still and like just sway really slowly was extremely difficult. That was, for me, really kind of surprising, and I was really happy about that. Actually, it was this thing that was just like wouldn't. And so that was, I guess, for me, those are the kind of places I think I try to look for. Of course, part of the force of is and isn't is relying on the fact that there's first the is, right? In this case, Michael Jackson, or elderly people. So, I mean, in a certain way, I think I still work from a semiotic basis, and there's something which is representational, recognizable. But from this point, rather than it somehow doing what we know of, or even cutting or mixing and matching it with different things, etc., I tried to really try to integrate a physicality or a way of moving which is from somewhere completely else.
Are you interested in saying, for example, the Michael Jackson guy having difficulty with swaying?
Yeah.
So it's something. So this difficulty actually happened when it was there, no? So are you interested in, let's say, sharing, because representation is too strong, but when people come to watch what you created with this guy, so are you interested in this difficulty to be visible, tangible, experientiable?
Yeah. I don't know.
Am I clear? So.
Yeah, you're clear. I think it's an interesting. In March, I tried to do a project with a filmmaker where we rented 5 camels, and we tried to get them to do a piece of a Merce Cunningham dance piece. And speaking of difficulty, this was really hard. And I think what we found there was that there was something really interesting in the tape, which was outside of, so there was the actual camera on the, but I had my camera sort of behind, just rolling the whole time. And in this weird way, I think what became more interesting was us trying to do this ridiculous thing. And in that case, I would say yeah. But I wouldn't say always or necessarily. I mean, I'm still, let's say I appreciate fiction. And so even if it's a fiction which is kind of born of like sort of disparate things that don't fit easily together, I don't know that it's always the best idea to show the outside of the frame, you know, as a rule or something. This
So
is
many things.
I know.
Also, you know, I was thinking, for example, when you were talking about, like you mentioned in the 60s performance art and real body and so on. You know, you obviously you don't use this real in the Lacanian sense, but just something that it's not this embodied kind of. Basically, it's not the. Basically, body doesn't disappear on the account of form.
The body
doesn't disappear on the account of certain kind of form or style or something. Basically, the presence of the body instead of representation of the body, kind of in this performance art of the 60s, basically. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a yeah.
No, because you know, I guess also, and you said that basically, if I understood right, that for example, the guy from the Jack has puts things into his different kind of holes in his body, and he says he makes a statement, kind of, and so what?
Yeah, I mean, not explicitly, but I think implicitly that's the statement.
Yeah. No, because I was thinking, for example, also I guess this kind of realness of the body, I think also you're touching on the kind of official historical line, isn't it? True. And you come from New York, you know, like it's basically everything happened kind of, this performance art was very present in the 60s, 50s, 60s and so on. But for example, because I was also kind of thinking about these performances that basically they generate in the spectator something as kind of real in the Lacanian sense. Basically, there's kind of a break with the line of symbolic while facing the spectator and so on. There is a presence, let's say, there's something that it's not finished, something that it has to be altered by the spectator, or, you know, like it's a relational kind of thing. And this is, of course, something that changes culturally in different geocultural regions, I guess, as well. Because basically body in one part of the world has a kind, you know, it's perceived a little bit differently than on the other. Yeah, so this is something that I was thinking while you were, because while you were talking, and yeah, because I'm thinking about what you are developing, I mean, in connection with the kind of perception of it. Because I think this is quite, also, for example, generating, for example, if you as a choreographer if you want to produce something like it is and it isn't, this is also in terms of perception something that might be perceived as such or differently perceived, but in some kind of, in certain cultural context, I guess not perceived as such at all. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, I'm just, you know, thinking out loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
And this is because I think let's say the situation that you're describing, I think addresses the body of spectator quite directly. And it's something.
but I mean, I think let's remember, like the performance artists that I'm speaking about, the actions that they did, I would say, wasn't for the sake of shock. I think there was something which was much stronger than that at stake. So I think that any situation that you enter into with a performance, what makes performance the strongest medium for me, the most interesting medium for me, is the level of mimicry, not in terms of what the performer is doing, imitating this or that, but the mimicry which is happening between the performer and an audience. Which is to say that, for me, if you're in the audience, you are experiencing the experience of the performer to some degree. And this is where the point becomes interesting, I think, to produce something which is painful on yourself. I think the implications of that become interesting only in this situation. And on MTV or any television or whatever, totally not interesting. So I don't know, I try to think about this question of mimicry, or of, what's the word I'm looking for? Visceral, kind of visceral experience. I try to think about that as well now in terms of materials. I mean, that's something that I start to question. So of course, we can have this kind of association or empathy with something which looks and feels similar to us. Can we have it with something which doesn't look and feel similar to us? That's a bit the research area.
But anyway, the objects are so personified.
Personified?
Yeah. That, I mean, I can hardly say that this doesn't look human to me. You know? What is there in this world that doesn't look human to us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's also about, let's say, a sense of movement. Because, I mean, there is this history of objects. This isn't anything new. I mean, next to these practices that I was talking about of performance art, you also had a lot of dance, which was already working with objects, but from a completely different notion, right? And that was really the idea of a kind of ready-made, and the idea of a very, I'd say, quotidian body, which was a kind of object, in a certain sense. I mean, I think that's what Yvonne Rayner's point was somehow very much about. It's like treating the body as an object, you know, and not getting into, or fantasy land of, you know, this virtuosity. And so there, I think you had a certain dialogue between objects and bodies, which I would say had very different intentions than the ones that me and a lot of other people that I work around, or that I associate with in terms of work, have. And comes down to movement. I don't know how else to say that, but of course, if you can, there's this association between movement and life, and if something moves, it is somehow alive. And if we can somehow allow it or make it move, or allow the perception of it that it's moving, I think it.
But on the other hand, you have sound that is also like this is just pure movement.
With sound.
Yeah. And if it's artificial, it's not necessary to be like alive.
And what kind do you
like,
mean?
and if you draw something, it's also a moving object, or something that is on the wheel running, for example. So
yeah, I mean, I would say there's a difference between. I would say there's a difference between the inherent movement in sound and, let's say, the movement of sound, like literally, having sound which is moving. I mean, one could think of choreography of sound, I don't know. But I still would try to think of that in terms of organization of movement in time and space, like this very kind of classic definition of choreography, and to think about how that can be applied to as many things as it can be applied to, not just human bodies. That these things already do that isn't so much the point, I guess, for me. I mean, the speaker is moving right now, like, yes, and the sounds around the space, they are moving, of course. But I guess I'm not a minimalist in the Keynesian sense of bringing attention to those things. Yeah, a little bit more like willful and, that typical director thing. You want to make things move. Does that get at what you're talking
Should we stop at this point? We still have time. I don't know, we can informally continue outside.
about? That sounds good.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.